Right now, more than 1,000 feet above 57th Street in Manhattan, there is a crack. Not a hairline, not the kind of cosmetic fracture that every concrete building develops as it settles into its first decade. According to a lawsuit filed in the New York State Supreme Court, there is a crack 10 inches deep inside the reinforced concrete core of the tallest residential building in the Western Hemisphere. 10 inches into the structural spine of the most expensive condominium ever built in New York City. A building that cost more than $3 billion. A building marketed as the building of the 21st century. A building where a single penthouse sold for nearly $88 million. And according to the people who live there, that building is failing from the inside out. This is the story of 432 Park Avenue. It is a story about physics and money and ambition and the specific decisions that get made when a developer wants a building to look a certain way and the engineers tell him it cannot safely be built that way. It is a story with a dead architect, a foreclosed developer, a Saudi billionaire who has never spent a single night in the penthouse he bought, and a condo board that is now accusing the people who built their building of what their attorneys call a deliberate and far-reaching fraud. It is a long story, and I'm going to tell you all of it, because the short version that has been circulating does not do justice to how this happened or to how many warnings were ignored along the way. Let me start with the ambition, because you cannot understand the failure without understanding what they were trying to do. In 2011, a New York real estate developer named Harry Macklowe stood up at a global real estate conference and announced that he was going to build a monument. Macklowe is a legend in New York development. He is an old-school operator who takes enormous swings and does not deal in small gestures. His words, by multiple accounts, were that this would be the building of the 21st century, the way the Empire State Building was the building of the 20th. He was not selling apartments, he was selling a place in history. The site was the old Drake Hotel on Park Avenue, which Macklowe had acquired in 2006 for around $413 million. To build his monument, he partnered with a Los Angeles-based investment firm called CIM Group, which had stepped in years earlier to help rescue Macklowe's position on the site. And to design it, he hired one of the most celebrated architects alive, Rafael Viñoly, the Uruguayan-born designer behind the Tokyo International Forum and a string of internationally recognized buildings. The structural engineering went to WSP, the firm that helped invent the modern super tall skyscraper. On paper, this was the best team money could assemble. The design Viñoly produced was famously inspired by a trash can, specifically a 1905 wastebasket designed by the Austrian designer Joseph Hoffmann, which Viñoly reportedly kept on his desk. A perfect square grid, clean and repeating, scaled up into a tower. The most expensive residential building in the Western Hemisphere was modeled on a receptacle for garbage. I am not editorializing when I say that. It is in the public record of how the building was designed. And I personally think it is one of those details that seems like a small irony at the start of a story and then grows heavier as the story goes on. Here is what they set out to build. A tower 1,396 feet tall, 96 stories, a footprint that is a perfect square, roughly 93 feet on each side. That produces a height-to-width ratio of about 15:1. I want you to sit with that number because it is the root of everything that follows. Engineers classify a building as wind-sensitive when its height-to-width ratio crosses 5:1. 432 Park Avenue was designed at 3 times that threshold. When it topped out, it was the most slender, super tall building on the planet. Picture a number 2 pencil balanced on its eraser, and then picture the wind blowing across the top of it. That is the physics problem the engineers were handed. The specific danger in a tower that's slender is not simply that the wind pushes it. It is a phenomenon called vortex shedding. When wind flows around a tall, slender structure, it does not just press against the face of the building and stop, it curls. It peels off the sides in alternating spinning eddies, first off one side, then the other, in a repeating rhythm. Engineers call that pattern a vortex street. And here's the dangerous part. If the rhythm of that vortex shedding happens to match the natural frequency at which the building wants to sway, the two reinforce each other, and the tower begins to oscillate sideways, perpendicular to the wind, in a feedback loop that can grow far beyond what the raw wind speed would suggest. The taller and thinner the building, the worse this problem becomes. For an office tower, some sway is tolerable because the workers go home at 6 o'clock. For a residential building, where people are trying to sleep, where they are trying to fill a bathtub, where they expect their doors to close, sway is a far bigger problem. So Vinoli and WSP built a layered defense against the wind, and I want to walk through it, because the sophistication of the engineering is part of what makes the later failures so striking. First, they cut 5 open mechanical floors into the tower, each one spanning 2 stories, spaced roughly every 12 floors up the height of the building. These are the dark open gaps you can see from the street. The idea is that wind blows straight through those openings, like punching holes in the sail of a boat, disrupting the organized vortex street before it can build into a destructive rhythm. Second, at each of those mechanical levels, they installed outrigger trusses spanning 2 full stories, tying the central concrete core to the perimeter columns to stiffen the whole structure. Third, they wrapped the entire tower in a grid of white concrete columns, a kind of exoskeleton, spaced at regular intervals up the full height. Fourth, they anchored the foundation with around 60 rock anchors driven 60 to 70 feet down into Manhattan bedrock. And fifth, at the very top, between floors 86 and 89, they installed 2 enormous tuned mass dampers, each weighing roughly 660 tons, designed to swing in opposition to the building's motion and cancel it out. At the center of all of it, holding the entire system together, is a 30-foot square reinforced concrete core, with walls roughly 30 inches thick at the base. That core is the spine of the building. It carries the wind loads. It resists the lateral forces. It is the single element in the entire structure that you cannot afford to compromise. Because if the spine fails, every other system fails with it. And that spine, according to the April 2025 lawsuit, is exactly where the 10-inch crack is now located. The materials were as extreme as the geometry. According to the engineering record, the project used around 70,000 cubic yards of concrete and 12,500 tons of reinforcing steel. The lower 38 stories were poured with concrete rated at 14,000 pounds per square inch, roughly twice the strength of a typical high-rise mix, strong enough in engineering terms to support a small mountain. And for the exterior, the team developed a specialized white Portland cement, chosen specifically for its color, for the way it would stand out clean and pale against the glass towers of Midtown. The structural engineers would later describe producing that high-strength, pumpable white concrete capable of being pushed up nearly 1,400 feet without separating or discoloring as one of the most demanding challenges of the entire project. And this is where I have to pause, because this is the hinge of the entire story. The white concrete was the signature. It was the brand. It was the thing that made 432 Park look like 432 Park. And according to the lawsuit, protecting that white concrete, keeping it pure and visible, drove a series of decisions that the residents now say doomed the building. If you have a strong opinion already about choosing the way a building looks over the way a building lasts, I want you to hold on to that thought, because I am going to ask you about it later, and the comment section on this one is going to be worth reading. But let me keep building the timeline first, because the warnings, according to the complaint, started before they poured a single floor. Construction began in earnest on the Drake Hotel site around 2012. The main contractor was Lend-Lease. The challenge they faced had genuinely never been solved at this scale. How do you pour tens of thousands of cubic yards of specialized white concrete into a 1,396-foot tower on a cramped Manhattan lot on a tight schedule while keeping the color consistent and the strength intact all the way up? The answer was a self-climbing concrete core system, a pouring apparatus with a placing boom and a crane that hydraulically lifted itself about 16 feet at a time as each floor was completed. Floor by floor, the tower rose at what observers at the time described as unusual speed. According to the 2025 complaint, the problem with the beautiful white concrete was durability. The engineers, the lawsuit says, wanted to add a standard ingredient called fly ash to the concrete mix. Fly ash makes concrete significantly more durable and more resistant to cracking over time. It is not exotic. It is used in concrete construction across the world. But fly ash, according to the complaint, would have made the concrete slightly darker. It would have compromised the pure white color that was the building's entire aesthetic identity. And so, the lawsuit alleges, the request to add fly ash was refused. The competitor coverage of this story has circulated a quote attributed to a structural engineer summarizing the choice in 3 words: color or cracks. I want to be careful here because I have not been able to independently verify that specific internal email in the primary court record available to me. So I am presenting it as what has been reported and alleged, not as established fact. But the broader allegation that durability was traded for appearance is at the center of the lawsuit the condo board actually filed. The engineers, according to the complaint, then proposed a backup plan. If they could not put fly ash in the concrete, they could coat the exterior with a thick, flexible elastomeric membrane, a waterproofing layer designed to seal any cracks that developed and block water from reaching the steel reinforcement inside the concrete. And here's the allegation that has become the headline of this entire story. According to the lawsuit, the developer rejected the elastomeric coating because an opaque coating would alter the appearance of the white concrete and reduce the building's appeal to the world's wealthiest buyers. Instead, according to the complaint, the facade received a clear silicone sealant, the same kind of material the lawsuit alleges was used to protect the hull of a yacht, a clear coating, so the white concrete could still show through. The look of the building, the complaint argues, was chosen over the protection of the building. I personally think this is the decision the entire case turns on if the allegations hold up in court, because everything downstream flows from water getting into concrete that was not adequately protected against it. And I want to be precise about something the careful coverage of this story gets right and the sloppy coverage gets wrong. There are actually 2 separate problems here. One is the cracking of the exterior white concrete facade, which is what the fly ash and the coating decisions were about. The other is the 10-inch crack later alleged in the building's structural core, which is a deeper and more serious matter. Both are real allegations in the case. Only the facade cracking was, according to the complaint, the subject of warnings before construction. I'm not going to blur those 2 together the way some retellings have, because the distinction matters. The tower topped out in October of 2014. It was certified complete in December of 2015. The first residents began moving in almost immediately, and almost immediately, according to the residents, the building began telling a very different story than the one in the marketing. And the marketing, I should say, was extraordinary. Macklowe reportedly spent around $1 million to commission a 4-minute promotional film from an Emmy-recognized production company. The centerpiece of the film was Philippe Petit, the high-wire artist famous for walking a tightrope between the Twin Towers in 1974, now depicted walking a virtual wire from the Empire State Building directly to 432 Park Avenue. The torch symbolically being passed from the building of the 20th century to the building of the 21st. It was abstract, it was artful, and by every financial measure, it worked. By 2014, before construction was even finished, half the units had sold for a combined $1 billion. By 2015, the building was 90% sold. The cheapest unit in the entire tower still cost more than $1 million. 4.3 2 Park became briefly the first condominium building in New York City history to cross $2 billion in sales. The projected total sellout was $3.1 billion, and by the developer's own reported accounting, the partnership cleared somewhere around $900 million in profit. The buyers were exactly who you would expect. Fawaz Al-Hokair, a Saudi retail billionaire whose company controls franchise rights to major global brands across the Middle East, paid $87.7 million for the penthouse on the 96th floor in 2016. Co-developer CIM Group, according to reporting, provided a $56 million loan to facilitate that very purchase. Thomas Peterfi, the founder of Interactive Brokers, took the entire 84th floor. Jennifer Lopez and Alex Rodriguez reportedly moved in by 2018. Many of the buyers purchased through anonymous shell companies, keeping their names out of the public record, which is itself part of the story of what these towers were really for. A significant number of the units at the top of Billionaire's Row were never primarily intended to be homes. They were vaults. Places to park global wealth in a stable market above a city most of the owners barely lived in. And here is where I want to ask you the first question, because we are about to leave the ambition behind and walk into the failures, and the comment section is the best part of a story like this. When you buy something purely as a trophy, purely as a place to store money, do you think you have the same right to be outraged when it falls apart as someone who actually needed a home? I genuinely want to know how you come down on that, because it shapes how you read everything that comes next. Tell me in the comments before you finish the video, and then tell me again at the end and see if your answer changed. Because the failures, when they came fast. The first sales had barely closed when the water started. On November 5th, 2017, according to the record, a catastrophic flood tore through the building between the 83rd and the 86th floors. A buyer named Juan Beckman Vidal, the chairman of the company behind the Jose Cuervo tequila brand and a member of one of Mexico's wealthiest families, had been in contract for an apartment priced at $46.25 million on the 86th floor. After the flooding, he sued to get his deposit back. That dispute was reportedly settled quietly about a year later. The leaks did not stop. In late November 2018, 2 major water failures happened within 4 days of each other. A flange burst on the 60th floor on November 22nd, and a water line failed on the 74th floor on November 26th. Water poured down 2 of the 4 residential elevator shafts. According to the record, total water damage in 2018 alone reached $9.7 million. 35 apartments were damaged by leaks. An elevator was out of service for weeks. And the building's insurance premiums, according to the residents, rose 300% over 2 years. By 2019, the residents were holding owners' meetings, and the minutes from those meetings began to read like dispatches from a haunted ship. Creaking, banging, clicking, metal partitions groaning as the building moved in the wind, a whistle in the door frames and the elevator shafts, which residents described as constant. Pipes inside the walls, according to the complaints, vibrated so violently when the tower swayed that bathtubs became effectively unusable because the water would not sit still. And then there is the detail that, more than any other, captured the public imagination. The trash chute. 432 Park Avenue's garbage chute is a straight vertical drop of roughly 1,300 feet, with no brakes and no offsets to slow anything down. When a resident on a high floor drops a bag of trash into it, that bag accelerates the entire way down. And by the time it reaches the bottom, it is moving at something approaching terminal velocity. According to the board meeting minutes, residents reported the impact vibrating through the walls of their bedrooms, a sound they described as a bomb going off inside the building, on a schedule, every single time someone took out the garbage. Imagine paying $20 million for an apartment in the most exclusive tower in New York and being woken by what sounds like an explosion every time a neighbor throws away a milk carton. Then came Halloween night, October 31st, 2019. The wind picked up over Manhattan. A resident stepped into one of the building's residential elevators. The system, as it is designed to do in high wind, slowed the car, and then it stopped. That resident sat trapped inside the elevator car, somewhere in the sky above 57th Street, for 1 hour and 25 minutes. The cause, according to reporting, traced back to the building's movement in the wind exceeding what the elevator system could comfortably absorb. In June of 2021, there was an electrical explosion, an arc flash in a mechanical room. According to reporting, a contractor working on a leak had drilled into live wiring and was thrown by the blast. It was, by the residents' account, the second such explosion in 3 years. If you are keeping a running tally in your head of everything that has gone wrong in a building not yet a decade old, I want you to drop a number in the comments right now. Just your gut estimate of how many separate defects you think a forensic survey would find in a building like this. Hold that number. Because when I tell you the figure the condo board survey actually arrived at, I want to know how close you were. In September of 2021, the condo board filed its first lawsuit against the developers CIM Group and Maclo Properties and the sponsor entity they had formed to build the tower. According to Bloomberg's reporting, the board sought as much as $250 million in damages, and the complaint documented more than 1,500 construction and design defects in the common elements of the building alone, many of which it described as life safety issues. The complaint included a line that has been widely quoted that the situation represented one of the worst examples of sponsor malfeasance in the development of a luxury condominium in the history of New York City. According to the residents, the chairman of CIM Group had even privately acknowledged that the noise and vibration inside the tower were, in his word, intolerable. The developers rejected the lawsuit forcefully. They called it ill-advised. They described 432 Park as a treasure and characterized the building as containing a sophisticated symphony of systems that simply needed fine-tuning as residents settled in. They said they had attempted to do further work but had been denied access to the building by the board. And notably, the developers argued that the lawsuit was not even supported by all the residents. Maclo himself reportedly described the board's lawsuit as a scorpion biting its own back because, in his view, publicizing the building's problems was destroying the value of the very units the residents were trying to protect. That first lawsuit did not resolve cleanly. It ground forward through the courts for years. By 2024, according to public reporting, it had produced more than 4 million pages of documents and dozens of days of deposition testimony. The fight became a finger-pointing exercise among the developer, the general contractor Lendlease, the engineering firm, the architect, and the various subcontractors, each pointing at the others, with the sponsor's liability was shielded behind the limited liability company structure that developers use precisely for situations like this. And while that litigation dragged on, the developer's own personal fortunes inside the building collapsed in a way that reads almost like a parable. In 2022, Harry Maclo purchased 3 units in his own building, on the 78th and 28th floors, for around $47 million. The financing for that purchase, according to reporting, came in the form of more than $46 million in loans from his own co-developer, CIM Group. The relationship between Maclo and CIM had been deteriorating for years, with Maclo alleging that CIM had cheated him out of more than $100 million in distributions he believed he was owed, and CIM alleging that Maclo was living lavishly while defaulting on the loans they had extended to him. In August 2023, CIM moved to foreclose on Maclo's units. He delayed the foreclosure with a bankruptcy filing, but he could not stop it. The man who called 432 Park the building of the 21st century lost his own apartments inside it, foreclosed on by the very partner he had built it with. Those forfeited 78th floor units, according to reporting, went into contract in early 2026 for around $53 million, sold not by Maclo, but by a CIM-linked entity. In March of 2023, Rafael Vinoli died. He was 78 years old. He died before the second and far more serious lawsuit was filed, which means the architect of the building never had to answer in a courtroom for any of what came out afterward. I want to note, because it is fair to note, that Vinoli's defenders point out that many of the most damaging decisions alleged in the case were developer decisions, not architect decisions, and that the tension between Vinoli and Maklow over design choices was well documented while the architect was alive. Vinoli was also no stranger to signature buildings producing unintended consequences. His walkie-talkie tower in London, with its concave glass facade, focused sunlight intensely enough to damage cars parked on the street below, and channeled wind strong enough to knock pedestrians off their feet. He publicly acknowledged that his team had made mistakes on that project. The pattern, his critics argue, was consistent. A bold signature shape is chosen, physics objects, and eventually the people using the building pay the price. Then, in April of 2025, the condo board filed its second lawsuit. And this one was bigger, and the language was far heavier. The 2025 complaint runs 46 pages. It seeks $165 million in damages, and it uses a phrase the first lawsuit did not: deliberate and far-reaching fraud. The core allegation of the second lawsuit is not merely that the building was poorly built, it is that the developers knew it was defective and concealed that knowledge in order to keep selling units at top prices. According to the complaint, a facade survey conducted in 2016, while the building was still actively being sold, identified 1,893 defects in the exterior, more than half of which were classified as life safety items. That report, the lawsuit alleges, was concealed from buyers who were signing contracts at the same time. The complaint goes further. According to CNN's reporting on the filing, the lawsuit alleges that the architecture firm SLCE made materially false claims in the building's offering plan, the legal disclosure document that buyers review before purchasing. The complaint cites a specific change in the document's wording. Language that originally stated the concrete will prevent water penetration was allegedly changed to say it was designed to prevent water penetration. One word will change to designed to. In legal terms, the lawsuit argues that is the difference between a guarantee and a hope, and the change was allegedly made because the developers already knew the facade could not deliver the guarantee. The complaint also alleges that the contractor and the engineering firm sent a letter to the New York City Department of Buildings that misrepresented the nature, extent, and type of the cracking, allegedly omitting the most damaging findings of their own internal survey, while people were still buying and moving into the building. And at the center of all of it is the 10-inch crack. According to the 2025 complaint, the facade's defective design left it plagued with thousands of severe cracks, spalling, and deterioration, which led to major water infiltration and flooding, and, critically, to corrosion of the steel rebar reinforcing the concrete columns. I read you the exact substance of that allegation because it is the heart of the structural concern. When water reaches the steel reinforcement inside concrete, the steel begins to rust. When steel rusts, it expands, sometimes to several times its original volume. That expansion cracks the surrounding concrete from the inside out. The new cracks admit more water. The additional water corrodes more steel. The process feeds on itself, and it does not stabilize, and it does not reverse on its own. The complaint alleges that this process is now underway inside the structural columns of the building, and that somewhere inside the core, the spine that holds the entire 1,396-foot tower upright against the wind, there is a crack 10 inches deep. The developers deny all of it. CIM Group, in a statement to multiple outlets, said it vehemently denies the claim and will be moving to dismiss the complaint. The developers have previously characterized the residents' allegations as exaggerated. As of the most recent public record, the case is pending, it has not been ruled on, and these allegations have not been tested in court. I want to be completely clear about that because it matters. This is a lawsuit, not a verdict. What I have described is what the condo board alleges, supported by the survey documents and the offering plan language their attorneys have cited. The other side is entitled to its defense, and it has stated its defense plainly. Now, I want to turn to the part of this story that I think gets too little attention, which is what it has actually been like to live there, and what the money has done. In 2021, the New York Times reporter Stefanos Chen broke the definitive account of the residents' experience. A woman named Serena Abramovich, who had paid $17 million for her unit in 2016, told him that she had been convinced it would be the best building in New York, that the developers were still billing it as a gift to the world, and that it was not. She told him that everybody in the building hated each other. She told him that if she had known then what she knew now, she would never have bought. And she said one sentence that I think captures the entire story better than any engineering report could. Everything here, she said, was camouflage. The financial wreckage tells the same story in numbers. Thomas Peterfy sold his 84th floor unit in 2024 for $13.5 million, a substantial loss on what he had paid. A unit on the 79th floor, originally listed at $135 million, was cut to $92 million in 2023 and finally sold that October for $65.6 million, less than half its original asking price. And the penthouse, the $87.7 million trophy on the 96th floor that Fawaz Al-Hokair bought in 2016 and reportedly never spent a night in, became the symbol of the whole collapse. He listed it in 2021 for $169 million, aiming to nearly double his money in the post-pandemic luxury boom and set a city record. It did not sell. He cut it to $130 million in 2023. He cut it again to $105 million in 2024. And here I have to correct a piece of misinformation that has spread through the sloppier retellings of this story. The penthouse was not listed at $15 million. That figure is false. What is true is striking enough without exaggeration. A Saudi billionaire has been trying to unload an $88 million penthouse for years, cutting the price by tens of millions, and as of the most recent reporting, even at a steeply reduced price, it has been extraordinarily difficult to sell. The wealthiest buyers in the world have looked at that apartment and at the lawsuits surrounding the building and walked away. Even the amenities tell the story. The private members restaurant that was supposed to be a crown jewel perk for residents reportedly cost each household around $1,200 a year when the building opened in 2015. By 2020, according to the residents, that annual charge had climbed to around $15,000. The costs of keeping the building running were landing on the people who lived there in ways the marketing never mentioned, and the largest bill has not even arrived. According to estimates cited in the reporting, refurbishing the two 660-ton tuned mass dampers at the top of the tower, the counterweights that are the only thing keeping the building's sway within livable limits, could cost on the order of $100 million on its own. The facade remediation has been estimated in similar territory. For a building not yet 10 years old, the repair bills run into the hundreds of millions of dollars on top of the litigation, which reportedly consumes millions of dollars a year in legal fees on its own. There is a building in downtown San Francisco where, if you set a marble down on the floor of certain apartments, it will roll on its own. Not because the floor was built wrong, but because the entire building is tilting. The Millennium Tower at 301 Mission Street is 645 feet tall, 58 stories, and home to 419 luxury condominiums that once sold for as much as $10 million each. It opened in 2009 as the most prestigious residential address in the city. And almost from the moment it opened, it began sinking into the ground beneath it and leaning slowly and relentlessly toward the northwest. As of the most recent monitoring data, the top of the tower leans about 29 inches off true. A $120 million engineering rescue was supposed to stop the sinking and pull the building back towards straight. The sinking, by the engineer's own account, has finally been arrested, but the tilt that the same engineers predicted they would correct by 4 inches has so far come back by about 1 inch. This is the story of how the most expensive residential tower San Francisco had ever built became the city's most expensive engineering embarrassment. How a foundation decision made to save time and money in 2005 produced a problem that could not be undone, and how the fix for that problem ran into trouble of its own. It is a story about the ground we build on, about what engineers can and cannot predict, and about the gap between a building that is technically safe and a building that anyone actually wants to live in. This is document number 1. The Millennium Tower file is open. To understand what happened to this building, you have to understand what is underneath it, because the entire story begins below the street. 301 Mission Street sits in San Francisco's south of Market District on land that 2 centuries ago was part of the bay itself. It is reclaimed shoreline. If you drill down through the foundation, you pass through layers, in order. First, artificial fill, the loose material dumped to create the land in the city's early days. Then a layer of soft, compressible marine clay that geologists call Young Bay mud, then a denser layer of sand known as the Colma Formation, then a stiff but still compressing layer called Old Bay clay, and finally, around 200 feet down, the actual bedrock of the Franciscan complex. Here is the single most important fact in the entire story. Almost every super tall building in San Francisco is anchored into that bedrock. The Salesforce Tower 2 blocks away sits on piles driven the full 200 feet down to rock. So do the other major towers in the financial district. The Millennium Tower does not. When the developer, an entity tied to Millennium Partners, broke ground in the mid-2000s, the foundation they built was a roughly 10-foot thick concrete mat resting on around 950 reinforced concrete friction piles. Those piles went down 60 to 90 feet, and they stopped in the Colma sand. They did not reach bedrock. Now, a friction pile is not inherently a mistake. It does not work by standing on a hard layer the way a bedrock pile does. It works by gripping the soil along its entire length, using friction between the concrete and the surrounding earth to hold the building up. Done with the right calculations in the right ground, friction piles work fine, and they are cheaper and faster than drilling all the way to rock. The design team's models projected that the building would settle about 5.5 inches over its lifetime, with the bulk of that settlement coming from the deep Old Bay clay layer slowly compressing. 5.5 inches by the year 2028. That was the prediction. That was the number everyone signed off on. There was one factor those models underweighted: the sheer weight of the building. The Millennium Tower was built primarily of reinforced concrete rather than the lighter steel framing that most San Francisco high-rises use. Concrete is heavier. According to the engineering accounts, the finished tower imposed something on the order of 11,000 pounds per square foot on its foundation, roughly 100 times the pressure a typical single-story house places on the ground. That enormous load sat on friction piles, which sat in sand, which sat on top of a still compressing clay layer, which sat on reclaimed bay mud. And the heavier the load on that clay, the faster it would squeeze, like water being pressed out of a sponge. I want to pause here because I think the foundation decision is where the moral weight of this story actually sits, and I want to know what you think about it before we go any further. The engineers who chose friction piles were not incompetent. Under the assumptions available in 2005, the choice was defensible. Going to bedrock would have been slower and more expensive, and nobody likes to pay for a margin of safety they have been told they do not need. So here is my honest question for you, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments as we go. When a building like this fails, is that a failure of the engineers who ran the numbers, a failure of the developer who wanted it built cheaper and faster, or a failure of a system that lets people build 645-foot towers on reclaimed mud without requiring them to reach bedrock? Hold your answer. I'm going to come back to it. Because the sinking started immediately. By the time the building opened in 2009, it was already settling faster than the models had predicted. And then a second factor entered the story. Between roughly 2010 and 2014, construction began on the Transbay Transit Center, a massive new transportation hub less than 100 feet away. That project required digging an enormous pit and pumping huge volumes of groundwater out of the surrounding soil to keep the excavation dry. When you pull water out of the ground like that, you increase the effective stress on the clay layers underneath, and you accelerate exactly the kind of consolidation that was already squeezing the Millennium Tower's foundation. The developer would later argue that this dewatering next door was the real cause of the excessive settlement. The Transbay Authority would counter that the tower had already sunk around 10 inches before their below-grade work even started. Both of those claims, as we will see, ended up in court. By 2014, residents on the upper floors started noticing things they could not quite explain. Doors that would not close because the frames were no longer square. Hairline cracks at the corners of the drywall. Window frames that seemed slightly off. Vertical lines inside the apartments, the edges of door frames, window mullions, the lines of cabinetry that no longer matched the verticals of the city outside the glass. Some residents reported the building creaking during temperature swings. Down in the parking levels in the basement, walls showed their own fractures, and at least one couple described finding water that appeared to be seeping through the concrete and chunks of wall that had crumbled away in a building that was at that point only about 7 years old. And on the 6th floor, an attorney and homeowner named Jerry Dodson, who had become one of the central figures in the entire saga, started paying very close attention. Dodson is the man who would later become famous for a single demonstration, setting a marble down on the floor of his unit and filming it roll, on its own, toward the northwest, toward Fremont Street. That marble became the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire story because you did not need to be an engineer to understand it. It is worth pausing on who actually lived in this building because it shapes how the story played in the press. The Millennium Tower was not anonymous luxury. It was marketed by Millennium Partners as the most exclusive address in San Francisco, with a private club lounge, a wine cellar, a spa, valet parking, and interiors by a celebrated design firm. The former San Francisco 49ers quarterback Joe Montana owned a unit. The venture capitalist Tom Perkins built out a penthouse. Hedge fund principals, tech executives, and professional athletes filled the upper floors. These were people with options who chose this tower and who are now watching the value of their choice collapse in public. When a building full of the wealthy and the connected starts sinking, it does not stay quiet for long. The story broke into public view on August 2nd, 2016, when the NBC Bay Area Investigative Unit, led by reporter Jackson Van Derbecken, who has stayed on this story for the better part of a decade, reported that the building had sunk about 16 inches and was tilting toward the northwest, 16 inches, against a lifetime prediction of 5.5. The building had blown through its entire projected lifetime settlement 3 times over in about 7 years. And the worst part was not the sinking itself. It was that the sinking was uneven. The northwest corner had gone down further than the rest, and that differential settlement is what produced the lean. A building can sink straight down a foot and be perfectly fine. It is when one corner drops faster than the others that you get a tower leaning over a financial district. If you have ever bought anything that turned out to be quietly defective in a way the seller knew about and you did not, drop a word in the comments about what that was. Because what these residents were about to go through is that experience multiplied by several $1 million. And the comment section on this one is going to be its own story. Once the news was public, the response was immediate and it was ugly. The San Francisco Department of Building Inspection confirmed the figures. In 2016, the San Francisco City Attorney, Dennis Herrera, filed suit against the developer, alleging that they had failed to properly disclose the settlement to buyers. His words at the time were pointed, that the city would not sit by and allow a developer to enrich themselves at the expense of others by hiding crucial information they were legally required to disclose. In 2017, the Homeowners Association filed its own lawsuit against Millennium Partners, the contractor Webcor, the architect Handel Architects, and others, seeking around $200 million to cover repairs. The developer fired back by blaming the Transbay Transit Center next door. The Transbay Authority fired back with monitoring records showing the tower had already sunk 10 inches before they began. And the geotechnical experts who looked at the whole picture landed somewhere more uncomfortable for everyone, that this was a bad combination from the start. A very heavy concrete tower on a friction pile foundation stopped in sand rather than bedrock, built on reclaimed ground where the deep clay was always going to compress more than the optimists hoped, and then pushed over the edge by the dewatering next door. In the middle of all of it were the residents, people who had paid $2 million, $5 million, $10 million for what they believed was the most solid address in the city, who now owned apartments in a building that was on the national news as the Leaning Tower of San Francisco. The property values reflect the verdict the market reached almost instantly. We will come back to those numbers because they are brutal, but first I want to walk through the city's safety question because it matters and because it is the part most people get wrong. With the building in the headlines, the city commissioned a panel of independent experts to assess whether the Millennium Tower was actually dangerous. Was it at risk of falling? Were the residents in danger, both in everyday use and in the event of a major earthquake, which in San Francisco is not a hypothetical? The panel's conclusion, which has been reaffirmed repeatedly since, was that the building was structurally safe. The settlement had not compromised its ability to withstand a strong earthquake. It was not going to fall over. I want to be completely clear about that because the dramatic retellings of this story often blur it. By every engineering assessment from the city and from the building's own engineers, the Millennium Tower's structural integrity was never actually in question. What was in question was its tilt, its continued movement, its serviceability, and its value. A building can be entirely safe to occupy and still be a financial catastrophe and an engineering embarrassment. The Millennium Tower is the proof. But safe or not, something had to be done because the building had not stopped moving. By the time the expert panel did its work, the tower had settled further and was out of plumb by more than a foot. It was at points tilting at a rate of around 3 inches per year and sinking around half an inch per year. Left alone, the engineers warned, it could eventually reach a lean where the elevators and the plumbing would stop functioning, the threshold for which has been described as around 40 inches of tilt. At that point, the building becomes uninhabitable, not because it is unsafe, but because you cannot run an elevator or drain a pipe in a tower that is leaning too far. The clock was running. Now, I want to put the tilt in perspective, because the phrase leaning tower conjures an image that is more dramatic than the reality, and being honest about that is part of doing this properly. The most famous leaning building in the world, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, at its worst, leaned about 5 degrees, before it was stabilized down to closer to 4. If the Millennium Tower were leaning that badly, the top would be displaced by something like 13 meters, dozens of feet, and it would be obvious to anyone standing on the street. It is not. The Millennium Tower's lean is currently less than 1/5 of a degree. You cannot see it with the naked eye. The 29 inches of displacement at the top sounds enormous. And inside the building, it absolutely matters, but on a 645-foot tower, it is a small angle. This is the paradox that runs through the entire story. The building is simultaneously a dramatic engineering failure and a structure that, to a person walking past it on Mission Street, looks completely normal. Both of those things are true, and the gap between them is where all the lawsuits, all the anxiety, and all the lost property value actually live. The litigation, mercifully, did not run forever. After years of complex legal warfare involving 9 separate lawsuits and around 400 individual parties, a comprehensive settlement was reached through private mediation in 2019. The terms were revealing. No single party admitted fault. The condo owners would be compensated for their lost property value. The public, through the Transbay Joint Powers Authority, contributed around $30 million of taxpayer money to the settlement. while continuing to deny that the transit center had caused the damage, on the logic that fighting the lawsuits for years would have cost more. The total size of the settlement was kept confidential and is understood to be substantially larger than that public share. And most importantly, the settlement money would fund a fix. The building would be repaired. And this is where the story turns into something closer to engineering science fiction, because fixing a 645-foot occupied skyscraper that is sinking into reclaimed mud is one of the hardest problems in the discipline. If you have made it this far into the file, you are exactly the kind of person these files are made for, because what comes next is the part the headlines never had the patience to explain properly. And I want to know whether the fix, as I lay it out, strikes you as brilliant engineering or as a gamble. Tell me in the comments which one you think it is, because the experts themselves did not agree. The man hired to design the fix was Ronald Hamburger, a senior principal at the firm Simpson, Gumpertz & Hager, and one of the most respected forensic structural engineers in the United States. After September 11, 2001, Hamburger led the structural investigation into the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. If anyone was qualified to save the Millennium Tower, it was him. And his original plan, developed by 2019, was logical. The problem was that the building's weight was resting on friction piles that were sinking into clay. The solution was to give part of the building new support that did reach bedrock. The plan called for 52 new piles drilled around the perimeter of the building, down roughly 250 feet to bedrock, then structurally tied into the existing foundation so that a portion of the tower's weight could be transferred off the failing friction piles and onto solid rock. The goal was not only to stop the sinking, but to recover some of the tilt by unloading the heavy northwest corner and letting the building slowly settle back toward straight. Work began in late 2020, and almost immediately, the fix made the problem worse. This is the part of the story that I think is genuinely important and that the celebratory accounts skip. As crews began drilling and excavating to install the new perimeter piles in 2021, the monitoring data showed the building sinking and tilting faster than it had been before the work started. The very act of drilling through the Old Bay clay and the vibration and soil disturbance that came with it was accelerating the consolidation that the project was supposed to stop. The tower leaned nearly 3 more inches to the west during this period. Investigators later found that crews had, at one point, left a gap of 1 to 4 days between excavating soil for a pile and injecting the grout meant to stabilize the hole, a delay that went against protocol and that an expert review suggested could help explain the rapid settlement during installation. In August 2021, with the building moving the wrong way, the city ordered the work paused. I want you to sit with the situation the engineers were now in. They had been hired to fix a sinking, leaning building. Their fix had made it sink and lean faster, and the entire project was under a national microscope, made even more intense because just 2 months earlier, in June 2021, the Champlain Towers South Condominium in Surfside, Florida, had collapsed without warning, killing nearly 100 people. I want to be careful here because the Surfside collapse and the Millennium Tower are completely different failures with completely different causes, and nobody has suggested the Millennium Tower is at risk of a Surfside-style collapse. But the timing meant that every regulator, every resident, and every reporter was watching the San Francisco fix with a new and unforgiving intensity. The engineers went back to the drawings, and the redesign they produced was radically smaller. Instead of 52 piles around the full perimeter, the revised plan used just 18 piles, already partly installed, concentrated on only 2 sides of the building, 12 along Fremont Street and 6 along Mission Street, the 2 faces toward which the tower was leaning. Fewer piles meant less drilling, less soil disturbance, and less risk of making the lean worse during construction. The piles would go down around 250 feet to bedrock, and a new collar would tie them into the existing concrete mat. The city signed off on the scaled-back plan in 2022. The engineers argued the 18 piles would accomplish the core objective, arresting the sinking and recovering a portion of the tilt over time. Outside experts questioned the computer models behind that claim, but the work proceeded. The load transfer, the actual process of shifting around 18 million pounds of the building's weight onto the new bedrock piles, was carried out in stages through 2023. And here, the news was genuinely good, at least on the primary objective. By mid-2023, the engineers reported that the settlement had been arrested. The building had, in their words, even risen slightly out of the ground. After 15 years of sinking, the sinking had stopped. On the thing it most needed to do, the fix worked. The tilt was a different story. Now here is where I have to ask you to keep me honest, and where the careful version of this story diverges sharply from the triumphant one. The engineers' own advanced computer model, the simulation they used to justify the fix and reassure the city and the residents, had forecast that the building would recover as much as 4 inches of its tilt within the first 6 months after the load transfer. That was the prediction. In the first 9 days, the tower recovered about 3/4 of an inch, and the engineers and the homeowners association celebrated. NBC Bay Area reported the early success. The retrofit later won a Project of the Year award from a National Structural Engineers Association. But then over the following 2 months, the tilt recovery stalled. And in the time since, the building has recovered only about 1 inch of tilt in total. 1 inch against a predicted 4. 25% of the forecast. The lead engineer's response to this gap was telling. He characterized the tilt recovery as a secondary benefit and said the primary objective had always been to stop the settlement, which it did. That is a defensible position. The building is no longer sinking, and that is a real achievement, but it is also a quiet redefinition of success. The fix was sold in part on its ability to pull the building back towards straight. It has pulled it back about an inch. The tower still leans roughly 29 inches at the northwest corner. A foundation engineer named Harry Poulos, reviewing the data, put it plainly. The building had stalled from the designer's viewpoint, which was their primary objective. But their objective of correcting the tilt to a significant extent had, in his words, not been met. And then came the part that nobody designing the fix appears to have anticipated. As the monitoring continued into 2024, NBC Bay Area's reporting surfaced a new concern: that the center of the building's mat foundation, the part between the original friction piles that is no longer being asked to do the same work now that the perimeter is partly supported on bedrock, appeared to be settling in a different pattern than the edges. The mechanism is still being studied, and I want to be precise that this is an emerging concern, not a confirmed structural failure. The leading hypothesis raised by longtime critics of the fix is that by strengthening only 2 sides of the building and anchoring the perimeter to bedrock, the load paths shifted in a way that lets the unsupported middle of the foundation keep compressing into the old bay clay underneath. In plain language, the edges are now being held, and the middle may be dishing. After all of it, the tower may no longer be simply tilting. It may be starting to bend. I personally think that possibility, if it bears out, is the most haunting detail in the entire file, because it would mean that the fix did not just underdeliver on the tilt. It would mean the fix changed the shape of the problem. And I want to be fair, the building remains, by every official assessment, safe and occupied, and the engineers maintain the settlement has been arrested. The dishing question is something monitoring will answer over years, not something anyone has declared a crisis. But it is exactly the kind of unintended consequence that has defined this building from the day the first marble rolled. Now let me tell you what all of this has cost, because the money is its own story. The fix was originally budgeted at $100 million. With the pause, the redesign, and the overruns, the actual cost came to around $120 million, on a building that originally cost around $350 million to build. And in 2023, the residents got a bill they did not expect. Out of an estimated $20 million in cost overruns on the retrofit, the homeowners were assessed around $6.8 million, charged at roughly $10 per square foot of condo space, due that October. People who had already watched the value of their homes collapse, who had already lived through years of news coverage and construction, were now being asked to personally write checks to cover the overruns on a fix for a problem they did not create. And the property values tell the verdict the market reached. The Millennium Tower was once so desirable that owners resold units for 2 and 3 times what they paid, with a penthouse reportedly trading for nearly $10 million. After 2016, the prices crashed, by some accounts, 30 to 50%. $5 million units traded for $2 to $3 million. Smaller units lost nearly half their value. And even after the fix was declared substantially complete, the discount did not close, because buyers know exactly what they are buying. A 60th floor unit that had once asked around $14 million reportedly sold after the fix for around $9 million. The repair stopped the sinking. It did not repair the reputation, and in real estate, reputation is priced in dollars. So let me bring this back to the question I asked you near the beginning, the one I asked you to hold. When this building failed, whose failure was it? Because now you have the whole picture. You have the engineers who chose friction piles under the assumptions of 2005, a choice that was defensible on paper and catastrophic in practice. You have the developer who wanted a tall building built on a competitive budget and schedule, and who, the city alleged, did not adequately disclose the settlement to buyers. You have the dewatering next door that accelerated a problem that was already underway. You have a regulatory system that allowed a 645-foot concrete tower to be built on reclaimed bay mud without requiring its foundation to reach bedrock the way the towers around it did. And you have a fix, designed by one of the best forensic engineers in the country, that stopped the sinking but recovered only a quarter of the tilt it promised, and may have introduced a new problem in the middle of the foundation. I genuinely want to know where you land now that you have all of it. Was this a failure of individuals or a failure of a system? And here is the second question, the one I really care about. If you were shopping for a home in San Francisco today, and you could buy a unit in the Millennium Tower at a 40% discount, in a building that is now anchored to bedrock on 2 sides, that the city insists is safe, that has stopped sinking but still leans 29 inches and may be dishing in the middle, would you buy it? At what price does the discount finally outweigh the risk and the reputation? Because somebody eventually has to answer that question for real every time one of those units goes on the market. Tell me your number in the comments. I read them all, and the debate on this one is the entire point. But the lesson the Millennium Tower teaches, if it teaches one, is not really about soil. It is about the decisions we cannot see. The foundation piles buried 90 feet underground, the geotechnical assumptions locked in a model, the settlement between parties negotiated behind closed doors, the line in a disclosure document that did or did not get read. The people who bought into this building trusted that all of those invisible decisions had been made correctly, because the building was beautiful and finished, and the city had approved it, and the famous had moved in. The entire disaster is a lesson in how much of modern life rests on things we never see and have no way to check, and on trusting that the people who made those decisions made them for the right reasons. Sometimes they did, sometimes the ground tells you, one rolling marble at a time, that they did not. This is document number 1. This is the full file, and Jerry Dodson's marble, as far as the public record shows, still rolls.